Hello. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining ConservativeHome in partnership with Landsec this afternoon. We're here for what I hope will be an extremely illuminating discussion about the future of our cities. Obviously, it's been a very tough 18 months for everyone, but particularly it's led to an enormous change in the way that we live and work, and the way that that plays out for the future of the urban economy could have huge implications both for London and for many other cities. You know, are we going to keep working from home? What impact will that have not only on workers but also on the places where they formerly worked? How do we adapt those communities to make sure that they can remain the vibrant places that we know and love? Joining me today are Councillor Rachael Robathan, the leader of Westminster City Council, Chris Hogwood, the always nice to bring a cheer chorus. Have you got one? Chris Hogwood, MD Corporate Affairs for Landsec. And of course, Neil O'Brien, MP, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Yeah, there we go.
This is a great tradition.
No, I think I'm just going to run with this from now on. It'll be the usual format. Our guests will speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we'll throw the floor open to questions. Right, and that's it from me. So over to you, Rachel.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this. And then I was told that I was going to be speaking first. So I guess this is where I lay out my stall and then the minister gets to reply and say none of that's going to happen. So I wanted to start really by just talking about Westminster, the city I represent, and the challenges and the opportunities facing us and what the last 18 months has taught us. So first of all, as we know, it's been a particularly difficult time for inner city areas. If you look at Westminster, we've got a resident population of 250,000, but pre-pandemic, over 1 million more people would come in every day in terms of workers coming into the city, in terms of tourists and visitors coming in to enjoy the culture, the nightlife and everything else that's going on in Westminster. So that is a huge driver for our central London economy. And what the last 18 months, of course, has shown is that all of that has changed, because yes, we've got the resident part which has remained resilient, which is the bit that gives the resilience, if you like, to all of the cities across the country and towns across the country. But for inner city areas, and particularly Westminster is particularly exposed to this, we've lost that office workers and visitors bit, which has severely impacted on our city centre and our city centre businesses. And the centre of Westminster, the West End, has still got less than 50% of its previous footfall, which is, I think I'm right in saying, still the hardest hit of anywhere in the entire country. So that's one of the first things. And of course, as we look forward in terms of the nature of this was about, we were asked to talk about the sustainability of cities and how we build back better. And of course, a key thing is going to be the future of work. Where are people going to come back into an office environment? Because if they don't, or they only come back part-time, then that has significant impacts both in terms of our office space and our property sector, but also for the hospitality businesses that thrive on that, the theatres where people spend their money after work, etc., etc. So that's going to be a big thing. Also, tourists. What are we doing to attract tourism? International tourists, an interesting fact, pre-pandemic spent £16 billion a year in London. That's a huge amount of money, and most of that would have been in the West End, because not many tourists come to London and don't visit the West End at some point. So that's a huge amount of income also that has gone, and that is also part of our sustainability. The other thing that it's shown us is the reliance on public transport. One of the things that has come up time and time again over the last 18 months is we want to come back, we're fine when we're back in London on the streets, in the office, but we're really worried about public transport. So you can't have a situation where people have to drive into our city centres. That would be a hugely retrograde step. So we need to think about how we rebuild confidence in public transport and enable people to feel comfortable again coming back on public transport into our city centres. So looking forward, how do we rebuild? How do we build back? So first of all, I think we need to look at what is the USP of our cities, and how do we play to that strength? How do we encourage people to come back in? We know there's a real benefit to having that creativity, that buzz, the innovation of people working together, but also coming in to enjoy what is so special about city centres. Once again, talking about Westminster, we are incredibly fortunate to have the most amazing heritage and culture and theatres and all of that amazing things. So part of it is encouraging people to come back to see it not as just a place to come and work, but also to enjoy that. Connectivity, transport, it's going to be absolutely vital. How do people move around? And it's not just around the actual transport, but also on foot. How easy is it for people to get around? The importance of the public realm is a really critical thing. So we have, I commissioned a survey recently, a national survey about the West End, about how people feel about it, about whether they're encouraged to come back, and also what could be done to improve their likelihood of coming back. And almost every single one of the things that people came back with were around the public realm, around the wish to have areas feeling less crowded, improved air quality, focus on the environment, all of those things, to have a pleasing public realm for them to enjoy when they're there. Not about the offer, nothing to do with more restaurants or more cultural offer or greater workplaces. It was all around the public realm, how people feel, how comfortable they are when they're there. And I think that's something really important for all of us in local government, but also the property industry to think about, and indeed central government to think about, as we look at how we rebuild our cities and make them places that people feel confident and comfortable spending time in and want to spend time in. Because quite frankly, it's very easy to do all your shopping online. We know that it's quite easy now to work from home. Why do people want to be in a city centre? We know we've got the cultural offer, but we also need to make sure that our public spaces are spaces that people want to spend time in. And finally, we need to address the issue of housing, which is a perennial issue, but we need to be able to make sure that that the housing we build is of the right sort of tenure, a range of tenures across all sorts of areas, so that we don't end up in city centres with only the very rich and the very poor able to live there, but across the tenure. So intermediate housing is equally important, so that lower income working families can also live in our city centres. We need to build in a very sustainable, environmentally supportive way. If we're going to do anything about tackling climate change, we have got to do that. In city centres, the vast bulk of emissions are driven by our buildings. 86% of emissions in Westminster come from our buildings and the way we occupy them. It's not about transport. Yes, we're doing a huge amount in terms of rolling out electric vehicle charging points. In fact, I'm rather proud of the fact that we've got more than any other borough. We've got over 1,000 and we're heading towards 1,500. But we need to look at how and so we need to do that. We need to absolutely make sure that our waste fleet is as efficient as it can be. We're rolling out a fully electric waste fleet. And I'd love to do some things around commercial waste as well. But we also need to be looking at how we build. We've updated our planning policies in Westminster to make sure that all developers are now building in a much more sustainable way, but we all need to be doing that, so that as well as having the right tenure, that we're building in a way that supports the environment, supports this whole issue of having a pleasant, attractive area in the centre of our city where people can work and visit and enjoy the space, with improved air quality, green spaces, and just a much more pleasant place to be. So I think for me, those are some of the key things as a starting point.
Lovely. And over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Henry. And thank you, Neil and Rachel, for joining us today, and obviously all the ConHome team for putting this on. I imagine it's a bit stressful having a government reshuffle 2 weeks before your conference programme, but I think it's worked out okay for us, so that's exciting. So for those of you who don't know Landsec, we're a commercial real estate developer. We are very strong in London, in Rachel's patch in particular, which is very much our home turf. We love it. We're also present in lots of cities around the country, for example, example, Leeds, where we own and operate Trinity Shopping Centre. There are three real types of place that we try and focus on. So offices that are knitted into the fabric of the cities where they operate, retail destinations, and increasingly mixed-use urban neighbourhoods. I think the thing that connects them all together is the current and future role of the city. We care deeply about the cities in which we operate, and we really want to contribute to their success. Now, as a business, we believe increased urbanisation is one of the key macro trends that's going to define the next 20, 30 years. So currently 55% of the global population live in urban areas. The UN expects that to get up to 70% by 2050. That creates lots of challenges, some of the ones that Rachel was just talking about there, how we use space, the impact of climate change, pollution, and so on. But it also creates lots of opportunities, the agglomeration effects of cities, of bright, smart people mingling, sharing ideas, creating culture, creating business opportunities, and so on. Now, you can find lots of economic reports that quantify the value of that. General rule of thumb in the developed world, the bigger a city is, the more productive it is. So it's in our national interest for our cities to succeed, particularly at a time when global competitiveness is something we have to care about deeply. I'm sure there'll be a few speeches about that at some point later on this week. But as Rachel said, we're coming out of a pandemic that's really challenged almost the core value on which cities are based, the value of bringing people together. Now, Rachel's touched briefly on the impact of hybrid working and what that might mean for cities, and I'm sure we'll get into conversation about that a little bit further down the line. My strong belief is that the sort of established and already successful cities like London will return. It's more about how quickly we help them return. And I suppose one of the things that's concerned me for the last 18 months in particular is that no political party nationally has really gripped the issue about how we restart our cities. I was lucky to hear Neil speak last night on the levelling up agenda and sort of expanding on that, which hopefully he's going to sort of layer on a bit more today. I actually found it very refreshing because it felt to me finally that someone was trying to address what's felt like quite a big public policy void for the last 18 months or so. Because I think without considered policy intervention, we risk creating a situation which is negative for robust cities like London or Manchester, where we are today. But I think it's even more concerning for some of those cities and towns that are perhaps less advanced in their development around the country. And it means we're not taking advantage of the opportunities they present for our country. Because while I think cities will reassert themselves over time, I think the ecosystem in which they're based is actually increasingly fragile. I think for years people have questioned whether they're getting a fair deal from city living, whether the sort of trade-off of job opportunities, higher wages versus the sort of costs of living in cities, the housing challenge, the quality of life, whether they're actually getting a proper deal from it. I think for some people the pandemic made up their mind. They left cities. Terrible decision in my mind, but some people did. And I think a lot of people are still questioning today whether it's the right thing to do. So we recently commissioned some focus groups from Public First to explore this, looking at voter attitudes to city living in 4 cities. So London, Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham. That's right, isn't it, Tom? Thank you, Tom. Good. It's a really rich piece of work, and we're digesting what it means for our business at the moment. We'll be releasing it publicly soon. I think there's 2 things I really wanted to share from that research with you today. The first is that city residents actually exhibit a very intense sense of loyalty and belonging to the city where they live. I think it's very in vogue to talk about belonging and place in some of those smaller towns, which are obviously in the political eye at the moment. But actually, city dwellers talk about the place where they live with that same sense of loyalty and emotional connection. I suspect he's not 100% popular with everyone on the panel or even in this room today, but anyone that attended Labour Party conference last week would have heard Andy Burnham talking quite a lot about how to harness that sort of sense of pride in place, both for political gains but also for public policy good. I think the second thing that really comes out of that research is that the value of the city is firmly in the balance. So concerns about crime, the cost of living, especially house prices, the lack of green space, public realm, the pace of change is actually pushing lots of people to think perhaps it's time for me to leave. Now, to me, it shows me that if you care about sustainable cities, thriving communities, and of course the UK's productivity challenge, we need national government, city and local government, private sector businesses like mine, really collaborating to make sure we tip the scales back the right way. Now, Neil has obviously got more considered thoughts on this than me, but from my perspective, for the levelling up agenda to succeed, it needs to unlock the productivity issue in our cities, and part of the way to do that is to address the quality of life challenge for the people that live there. So Henry, I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you very much, and I'm handing it straight over to, last but not least, Neil.
Oh, thank you very much. You're all connoisseurs of politics, and one of the things you'll all appreciate about a reshuffle is the moment where you have a minister has written formally to another minister, and by the time the reshuffle is complete, they find that they are the minister. So they have written, they have to reply to themselves, often to say, you're completely wrong, you've misunderstood the situation. I'm in a slightly similar situation as far as I used to write long, rambling, badly edited pieces about levelling up for ConservativeHome, and I'm now in the position
fantastically edited.
Disavowing. It's not criticism, in fact, it's not edited. For the record, it's a tight ship. There's no money wasted on nonsense like editing. Of the position of trying to drive forward the levelling up agenda and create our white paper that we'll be publishing relatively shortly. And so thinking about cities is a central part of that. It's a big part of our economy, and a lot of the battleground of politics is in and around our great cities. So, if we raise our gaze back a bit from the pandemic, what is the situation we see for our cities? Well, over the last 20 years, we've seen a revival of the UK's cities. After a long period after the war of really quite precipitous decline compared to the rest of the country, compared to the rest of Europe, we've seen a change in the trend. You know, if you think about between the end of the war and the millennium, population of somewhere like Liverpool shrank by half. Manchester saw a huge decline in population of that period. But then since the turn of the millennium, completely the reverse. You know, Manchester City, the centre of the city, has got 30% more residents than it did when I used to come here in the late 90s. And we're seeing also their productivity growing faster than the rest of the country as well. If you look at the top dozen cities outside London, their population's grown about 5% faster than the rest of the country outside London. And the productivity of all the secondary cities has also been growing faster. So there's been a trend towards the cities. The cities have revived, and there's a lot of different factors driving that. It's partly about the turn towards a services-based economy rather than a manufacturing one, and the growth of sort of knowledge-intensive jobs in city centres like this one. It's also based on some trends that, you know, we need to think about what is going to happen to those. Although we have a rising number of 18 to 21-year-olds over the next decade, we might want to think about how higher education might change. We might think about the trends of international migration that have particularly driven up the population of our large cities. So we don't exactly know what will happen as a result of the Zoom-based economy and the shift towards remote working. There's lots of speculation. Will we all be able to live a bit further out and come in 3 days a week? Will some people move to places where previously you couldn't really hold down a kind of high knowledge, highly skilled jobs and be able to live further out? We don't really know how these things will play out, but in a way they are helpful in tackling a challenge which a lot of our cities face, which is to radiate out the growth that we see in the centres to the rest of the conurbation. If you look at all of our cities, whether it's population or the productivity, you see this great revival in the very centre, but you see that taking quite a long time to flow out to the rest of the conurbation. So, Leeds is growing much faster than West Yorkshire, centre of Manchester, glass and steel exploding out of the ground, but even in the north of the city, never mind the rest of Greater Manchester, there's still a lot to do. And my 9 Conservative colleagues here in Greater Manchester are quick to remind me that there's all the rest of the city that we still need to level up. So what are we going to do about all this stuff? So there are 4 parts to the levelling up agenda. Hopefully soon we'll have repeated these often enough that you'll be able to say them in your sleep. It is about empowering local leaders and local communities. That's the first thing. It's about growing the private sector and increasing living standards, particularly where they're lower. The third thing is it's about spreading opportunity, core Conservative value, spreading opportunity and improving the public services where they're weaker. And last but not least, there's a sort of je ne sais quoi element, which is the fourth thing, which is kind of restoring local pride. And that's about a mixture of, the way the place feels, about regeneration, it's about the absence of crime, all those kind of things. So those are your 4 things. Soon we'll be able to do call and response soon of like empowering local leaders and local communities, and you'll know it all in a painful way. But what is behind all these objectives? These are the 4 objectives. What's behind them? So what are we going to do? So over the last period since 2014, we've had the city devolution agenda within England, and we've had city and growth deals, which are in some ways similar in Scotland and Wales. And that agenda, which started here with the Greater Manchester mayoral devolution deal in 2014, has spread to a lot of our other large cities. We now cover 40% of the population of England, 50% of the GDP of England. They're in areas that have a mayoral combined authority. And in places like in the West Midlands with Andy Street and up in Teesside with Ben Houchen, it is making a real difference, right? Because I know how to live, I know how to have a good time. So the other day I was having a chat to the lady who runs Adult Skills in the West Midlands, and it was genuinely inspirational. She was knocking heads together, she was getting better value for the taxpayer, she was getting a better service for 18 to 21-year-olds who are unemployed and on training courses, and it was making a huge difference because you had someone to coordinate, to bang heads together, to work out what the plan was, and to just tighten the nut in a way that central government is not going to be able to do from hundreds of miles away. So I think that these devolution deals are a good thing, and we can take them to the rest of the country, so we can widen the devolution agenda, we can do county deals, we can start to pick up some of the rest of our medium-sized cities as well, because we've still not got, 60% of England is not covered by devolution. And we can also go down a level as well to think about how we empower communities directly. It's not all just about elected politicians. It's, if you are my residents up in Erdby on the edge of Leicester and you're worried about crime in your neighbourhood, we've got some good things now like safer streets where you can activate, action to tackle your local problems. But what, we used to in the 80s, Mrs Thatcher had Neighbourhood Watch. What are we going to do to empower local people who want to do something about crime or whatever issue it is? So that's the first thing. So empowerment is the first thing. The second thing is about the private sector. Obviously, that's totally central. This agenda will totally fail unless it's about growing the private sector, not the government, the private sector. So we're doing good things there. We've got the super deduction. We've got, humongous investment in research and development. How do we use that? Taking public investment in R&D from 13 billion to 22 billion over 5 years, huge increase. How do we use that to really get behind not just academic research, but business investment in high-tech jobs and high-skilled jobs? How do we build up networks of finance? A lot of small businesses still struggling to get the cash they want, either in terms of debt or in terms of equity. We've made good interventions. We've got a thing here called the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, as an equivalent in the Midlands, trying to catalyse those ecosystems of private finance. So there's still a lot more we can do on that agenda. And how do we get those crucial kind of inward investments into the country? We know that foreign direct investment can be really transformative for productivity, and that is why Mrs Thatcher battled to get Nissan to move to Sunderland, right? Because she knew that it would change not just Sunderland, but it would also change, the whole of the UK car industry by bringing those new ideas, new ways of doing things. So, growing private sector. That's the second thing. Opportunity. Within the cities, we've done these joined up transport budgets. So places like this can invest in their tram network, they can plan over multiple years, they can have one single budget that's flexible, not 15 different budgets from Whitehall. So that's encouraging, and we're obviously doing lots of high profile things in terms of connecting our cities together, in terms of the Northern Powerhouse Rail, the integrated rail plan, HS2, all those things, so we can get around the country more quickly. And then I suppose the question is, how do we build on all the things we've done that are about human capital rather than physical capital? We've introduced T levels. I think that's a really important change, right? What are we doing for the 50% of kids who don't go to university? What are we doing to build up technical education? And we've got T levels, a proper equivalent of A levels, 25% more funding, 50% more time in the workplace, less, classroom, more workplace. What do we do to build on things like the lifetime learning allowance? So, people like my mum, we were going through some old documents in our house the other day, and I found my mum's certificates from when she retrained after I was born. And at that time, it was relatively easy to access those kind of things. So we started bringing that back, right? The ability to get, if you don't have A levels, a second chance. You want to be in a society that's got second chances for people to get higher qualifications, higher pay, and get on in life. And then the last thing, the local pride is almost in some ways the most connected to this conversation, because not only is it very important for our economy in the ways that Rachel's described, I think people use their high street, their city centre, their town centre as a sort of barometer of how the local economy is doing and how the country is doing for that matter. So how do we make sure that they adapt quickly to a change that we can't stop, right? In the Conservative Party, we don't believe we can stop change. The internet is here to stay. It's completely changed the way we all shop. We're all doing it. We've gone from, in 2018, £1 in every £25 being sent online to £1 in every £3 now. We've basically got too much retail space, is the truth, and there needs to be wholesale regeneration of our towns and cities. And we are doing a lot to help fund that and oil the wheels with the High Streets Fund and the Levelling Up Fund and the Towns Fund and the UK Spared Prosperity Fund. We're doing the things to get behind local communities to regenerate. But to my mind, there's also a question about how do we help and bring the expertise to places, because a lot of councils will never have masterminded. There is a role for local government to try and master plan what's going to happen to the town centre. A lot of them will never have done anything like that before. Not very many people in this country have done it. I mean, we're fortunate at Homes England to have got the man who masterminded the regeneration of King's Cross as our chair. But there's not too many people who have those skills out there. And the last one for me, because I've always, one of the reasons I'm in the party is I believe in being tough on crime and driving down crime. How do we make sure that we drive down the levels of kind of crime and antisocial behaviour that blight a lot of poorer places and make them not places you want to hang around? Like we can make the town centre look better, but if there's lots of kids hanging out and just being unpleasant, how do we people are not going to be there? How do you make them nice green spaces with the kind of attractive public parks that make them living in the city still an attractive thing to do that people want to do? So there's a lot of different parts of this agenda. I'm very interested in the views of everyone in this room to try and tap into your knowledge about what we should be doing on this agenda. I think I've set out roughly the sorts of things that we are trying to do, but within all those things, we're extremely open to all of your ideas. So I hope that together you can help us and contribute to this whole levelling up agenda.
Thank you for setting me up so nicely for the Q&A. Right, now we're moving on to the second part of the meeting. First of all, I should say that if you're tuning in on YouTube or the Conservative Party, you can also send me questions, apparently, and they'll appear on my laptop, so please do, if you know how to make that work. Q&A, a few simple ground rules. First, questions, not statements. I know everyone says it, but we really do mean it. Second, no questions that need statements. If our panel can't answer your question without you giving an awful lot of context, you're either asking the wrong question or you're asking the wrong panel. And third, one question, not a whole lot of them. Two connected questions is fine, but standing up and saying, I've got 3 questions on 3 unrelated points is, we want to give as many people an opportunity to speak. We've got about an hour, so if we could all show everyone else a little bit of courtesy, then we'll go a long way.
Strict, Henry. This is really tough.
When you do a lot of these,
fine.
Iron fist.
how many microphones have we got? 2. Perfect. Okay, so I'll take 2 questions at a time. So we'll start with Richard at the back and you, sir.
Thank you very much. Henry, great panel, really helpful introductions, and Neil, many congratulations. I represent a small city, Gloucester, and I think to some extent small cities are the people who can feel a bit left out. We won't necessarily benefit from devolution because we're not looking to be a sort of standalone, let's have an Andy Burnham big mayor type thing, or Ben Houchen more likely. So first question, bearing in mind Henry's rules, is will you give small cities the flexibility to remain in the structures they are rather than forcing devolution and unitaries on us, which we won't necessarily want? And the second related question is, one of the big challenges for us all is how we regenerate brownfield sites. If planning rules are very free and easy for the greenfield sites on the edge of small cities to be developed, we'll never really get away some of the brownfield sites. So what incentives and stimulation and support can you give to brownfield site development in small cities? Thank you.
Marvellous.
Is this working? Yeah, my name's Liam. I'm from the mixed-use developer First Space. We're based in the wonderful Westminster city. We also work in cities across the country. One of the things that I'd like to hear more from the panel about is just mentioned in the title, sustainability. So it'd be great to hear more about the panel from that.
Okay, in which case I think we'll just sort of go down and then back. So would you like to start, Chris, and then we'll...
Do you want me to talk about governance structures?
No, well, you can go with... The whole point of asking 2 questions at once is that you can choose either of them.
Got it. Because I have strong opinions on local government structures, having spent 6 years in London local government.
Oh, well then go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'll let Neil deal with that one. So I think sustainability, is a really, really key point, right? So as Rachel was sort of saying earlier, part of the problem in cities is the built environment. It's not actually good for the environment. So we signed up many years ago to a 2030 target, net zero. We were the first real estate investment trust to do that, and we are making good progress. It is difficult, right? So everything we're building now is going to be effectively be net zero. So we've got a couple of really interesting developments in Southwark. One's called The Forge and one's called Timber Square. Do go check them out. They're very, very exciting, very innovative, and they will be featuring at COP. When's that? Next month. So we're very proud of that. The big challenge is actually retrofitting existing stuff. That is hugely expensive, very, very time consuming and so on, and it's something we're spending a lot of time doing. I think we obviously talk a lot about sustainability in the kind of carbon sense. I think sustainability is also about the communities in which you operate as well, and those kind of challenges that I was talking about earlier in terms of, cost of living, opportunity, and so on, is something we also take really seriously. So our sustainability strategy is about 2 real things. It's about how we build well and how we help people live well. So giving people opportunities through either job retraining schemes or actually bringing people into the construction industry is a big focus of what we do, and we do a fair bit of it in Westminster. And I think actually, one of the big challenges as Westminster City Council comes back is actually jobs and opportunities for the young people that live and work there, I think.
Okay.
Let me focus in on Richard's two excellent questions. So, Prime Minister in his speech to summer was absolutely clear that he wanted to take a flexible approach. There wasn't going to be one size fits all. There was multiple ways of doing it. I think that we need to find decision-making structures that are effective and can actually make a decision. Obviously, if we're going to devolve power, there needs to be accountability somehow, and there needs to be a way of making decisions. But there's probably more than one way of skinning that particular cat. So he's clear about that. I think, in your neck of the woods, I think there's a really interesting opportunity that kind of spreads across quite a wide area. I think about that whole arc from sort of Bristol, Cheltenham, Gloucester, out over into South Wales. Just quite a lot of sort of R&D businesses, lots of innovation, there's quite a lot of high-tech stuff. And there are these initiatives like Western Gateway trying to sort of bring those things together to make them more on some of the parts. But I absolutely agree with you about smaller cities and how we do things slightly differently there. And on brownfield, I think you probably already know my view because you can read it on ConservativeHome about brownfield regeneration, the centrality of that. Britain has Europe's least dense cities. We've got quite a lot of brownfield land in some of the centres of those cities, and scope to have, by having gentle density in our cities, have better environmental results because there's less time spent commuting, more walking and cycling, less pollution, better public transport, all these things that we associate with those denser European cities. So take away eyesores that we get complaints about as MPs. There is a site in my constituency that is next to a mainline railway station. It's 1 hour from London. It was given planning permission in 2004, and it is still derelict. And how we bring about, give councils the powers, both fiscally and in terms of the law, to bring about those regenerations is the central question. I'm very proud of the things we've done in terms of Housing Infrastructure Fund, brownfield funding, and so on and so forth. But we do need to have a muscular approach. It's no good for politicians to say, oh yes, brownfield development, brownfield first. I've heard that for years, right? You've got to properly get behind these things with policies, money, power, in order to make them happen. Because I think that is the vision that most Conservatives clearly want. It's the right vision for economic and environmental reasons. That's the vision we should deliver. So I am broadly agreeing with you.
Well, let me just start. I think most of Richard's questions was actually above my pay grade, but I would just like to comment on, as the representative of another city, on the fact that empowering local leaders is making sure that the local leaders and the local population have a say in the planning and how their city looks. And if you take that away, then there will be huge resistance to anything that happens, and we will never be able to build the homes we need or do any of the things we need if we don't take local residents with us. And I was also just going to add on that point about empowering local leaders. I think we also need to look at how the link between business rates and what's happening with local issues, because at the moment we do want to invest in our areas and we do want to regenerate. So for example, for me in the West End, there's obviously a huge commitment that we've made to regenerating that area, but we need to be able to show how some of that benefit will come back to the residents, because at the moment 96% of business rates generated from Westminster get straight through to central government. So with the introduction of the online sales tax, which I hope is going to be introduced very shortly, it would be a really important thing if there was some link between that back to the business rates that are levied on physical premises, so that local residents know that by their local government investing and driving this part of their economy, that there is a benefit to the local residents. So we can say, with this improvement in terms of the economy, the GVA that we're delivering here, we're going to be able to invest in your streets, in your parks, in your whatever, that is providing a real benefit back to residents. Coming to the point about sustainability, you asked about some of the things that local areas are doing. Once again, I'm afraid, talk about my own bailiwick. So in Westminster, as you probably know, as you're based there, we've updated our planning documents with our ESPD, which is environmentally supplementary planning documents, which were introduced very recently to really beef up the green element of our planning documents, because as planning rules, because as I was saying earlier, 86% of the emissions in Westminster come from our buildings and the way we live in them. So we have to address that. And how we build is really important. I'm just going to mention we've got one regeneration scheme on the edge of Belgravia, so never say you can't build social housing in high asset areas. It is much more difficult and challenging with the 50% affordable requirement, but we're doing it. And it's going to have 90% less emissions than what was there at the moment, and the carbon footprint will be paid off in 11 years. So I think how we build, how we develop is really important. We're working with all of our great estates and big landowners in Westminster to deliver a sustainability charter, which will be, because obviously we have to do this in partnership with all of our other landlords. And so there's a whole slew of things around that which are really important in terms of green leases and making sure that they're also ensuring that their properties are occupied in a fully sustainable way. Retrofitting. A big sort of buzz thing that we're all talking about. We need to be able to retrofit social housing. It's hugely expensive, but in order to actually tackle emissions realistically, we need to do this. I can tell you that in Westminster we've got a total of 22,000 units, of which just over half are social housing, the rest are leased. If we were to bring all of our stock up to EPC-B, it would be this is not a very definitive figure, because some of it we won't be able to do it, but it would be about $250 million. So we're very grateful for the social housing retrofitting grant, which we are even now applying to. I think we're the first borough to be applying for it, but that's because we want to be quick off the mark. But it's going to be a very expensive thing, but we absolutely have to do that. You also asked about other things, so electric vehicle charging points I mentioned at the beginning. And the other thing I just really want to push, because this is something that we've been lobbying very hard for, and DFT and DEFRA have now included it in their policy statements, but I know there needs to be quite a bit more heft to get it over the line, and I'm working with other city leaders to try and push this, is around how we address commercial waste. So with domestic waste, we have one provider. We effectively own the domestic waste, so we can control that. So we have moving towards a fully electric fleet, and that's brilliant in Westminster. Commercial waste, as you know, is not something we control. We have over 50 providers in Westminster. They're all running around doing the same routes, and there's no incentive for them to use electric vehicles because it's just the cheapest one gets the deal. And we think that's wrong if we're worried about how the HGV movements in our city, but also emissions. New York can do this. They've reduced their emissions and HGV movements by 50%. So we would like to have the ability in city centres to be able to franchise the licences for commercial waste to reduce the number of companies actually doing this. I think it would be just a win-win.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll take Alex and then you, sir. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I've kind of talked to you about this, Neil, so sorry, you're getting it again. The two things on brownfield development that I think could make a difference, and I think you're right to identify it, Neil, as a key area and across the whole country. One is some kind of delivery contracts where house builders basically can't just sort of get permission and sit on it for ages and ages, or even sit on stuff in a plan stage, which obviously the planning bill could do, probably not the levelling up paper, but I think it's something that Go should hopefully be looking at. And secondly is the point around the whole planning reforms have now been put back. There's going to be a real problem where by the next election, most areas will not have any local plan, but they will have a post-COVID landscape that Councillor Robathan was talking about, where you have a changed system, but there's no plan. So are you going to be able to take that pie out and say, look, can you do your commercial centres first, rather than waiting until the local plans are in place in like 5 years after the government's actually sorted out what they're meant to look like?
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Will Brett, I'm a campaigns consultant. The Centre for Towns showed that big cities are getting younger and towns are getting older, which has all sorts of problems associated with it. But is it not also an opportunity, given that young people are the ones who most need sustainable, good urban development, including affordable homes? And how do you bring young people with you in the development of sustainable urban places?
Okay, thank you. I think we'll just go the other way. So would you be happy to start?
Yes. Well, let me start with that. I think it's much easier to bring young people with us because, as we all know, young people are much more invested and committed to the whole environmental agenda than other people. So I often talk about this. My daughter will, I'm sure, put her cross in the box at the next elections for whoever she thinks is most committed to the green agenda, which is why I have to show her it's me. But I think, so the young people, I think, are much more personally committed to this. You're right, city centres are likely to become younger and younger because people want to live in that more buzzing environment. And also, obviously, as family-sized units become more expensive, so people tend to move out. So I actually think it will be easier. Going back to the comments I made earlier, I think the whole issue with intermediate housing is really important. We flipped our planning policies in Westminster so that now 60% of our affordable allocation is for intermediate, so that we could address this thing of, of middle and lower income working families, working individuals, to be able to rent in Westminster. Sadly, the ownership model we can't get it to work in Westminster. Land prices are too high. But for an intermediate rent, it does work, and that's really important in terms of providing housing for young people. On your comment, yes, absolutely right, and I agree, and I completely support the piece about we don't want people just sitting on planning consents. It doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
To Alex's question, I think absolutely it's well worth trying to make redevelopment plans for town and city centres go faster even than local plans, because local plans, we are trying to streamline and make it go quicker, but there'll always be limits to that, and there's an urgent challenge about town and city centres which are in weaker economies, are quite battered by the pandemic, having already been battered by the recession of 2008-9. So there's a big challenge there, and we want to try and do as much as we can as quickly as we can, and build on the things that Homes England have been doing to help local places do good placemaking. And we now have Nick Boyce-Smith in doing the Office for Place, trying to help more places plan in a way that most Conservatives would find sympathetic to regenerate their town centres. So I think there's a lot we can do there. In terms of this point about the kind of parting of the ways between places, about how the average age of the population is a huge thing. I mean, to take the logic a bit further, actually, shire areas have got much older population. Tower Hamlets, I think, has gone from being like 9% pensioners to 6% pensioners. North Norfolk's gone from a quarter to like a third or something like that. It's huge divergence, which has big implications for a lot of things, from local government finance, because obviously there are a lot of costs that come with the older people, to changes in what, as Rachel said, changes in what people want in terms of what is in your local plan, what's supplied in terms of housing. And there's a question for us all to think through there about how do you create tenure types that will really answer the challenge of young working people for whom rents are just quite high, a big chunk of their income. What can you do for them beyond the things we're doing already? I think it's a great question.
Thank you. Alex, if anyone's not read it, Alex wrote a very good report about repurposing commercial space and some of the challenges therein, which I wholly endorse to the attendees. As Alex knows, I think I found the planning reforms as mooted slightly underwhelming. I don't think they really actually tackled the issue certainly our business faces. I think commercial property, offices, and even retail were hardly mentioned at all. It was very much geared around residential development, and actually very geared around house builders, I would say, rather than sort of more commercial property developers, who are increasingly actually going to be the way that residential schemes get delivered, I would say, over the next few years, and particularly on brownfield sites. I don't know what's happening with the reforms, and if Neil's going to let us know at some point in time, but it would be interesting to see how they come back. Because I think actually that repurposing point is really, really key. We've just been talking about how the pandemic has changed how we use some places, right? So how we are using offices, how people are shopping has been changing for a long time, and I think the pandemic has accelerated probably about 5 years of change into a year and so on. So lots of those centres are going to have to be rethought. If you have a look at what we're doing at the moment with the O2 Centre, which is on Finchley Road in the London Borough of Camden, effectively it's a retail centre which is doing okay, but long term it probably won't survive in quite the same form. So we're working out how we can repurpose lots of that existing space, build on the existing car park, which is actually more controversial than you think it should be, but effectively to create a new residential scheme, around 1,800 new homes, 35% affordable, and 50% of that space will be public realm. So new parks, new green space, allotments and so on, because we think that's really important for how we kind of bring a bit more quality of life into the area and so on. But that's quite challenging to do. It's a big scale scheme. It's in an area of London that probably feels like it's had a bit too much development and so on, so it's a long process to take people with it. We certainly won't sit on planning permission if we get it, so strong message here. Will, coming to you on the kind of the young people bit, I suppose it depends what you're talking about, young people. If you're kind of thinking the kind of early 20s and so on, key thing is making sure the affordable housing is there and it's appropriately delivered and getting that tenure mix actually right, so understanding what should be there for people to buy, what should be there to rent and so on, what should be social rent, which should be kind of slightly more intermediate and so on. And that only comes if you work closely with the local authority, right, and build that right relationship with them and understand what drives their needs. I think if you jump back a little bit further in the kind of age mix, what we're doing a lot of at the moment is actually involving genuinely young people. So 14.
Who are genuinely young people?
Younger than me.
I'm asking for a friend.
Well, so if you, I don't know how many people work in property development here, but if you do a sort of planning consultation, the average age of attendees tends to be north of 60. And it's very, very difficult getting young people interested because we ask them the questions that we would ask of a sort of 60-year-old, and they just don't think about place and space in the same way. So we're doing a really exciting program with the O2. It's the first time we're doing it. There's a very good thing called Voice Opportunity Power, which was created in part by Grosvenor, who are obviously also part of the broader Westminster family, which looks at how you involve young people in planning and placemaking. So we've signed up to do it in the O2. We launched it a couple of weeks ago. We had about 40, 50 school kids, basically. So you're talking sort of 16 to 18-year-olds coming along, committing to giving us their time to help us shape some of the public realm and the space on the O2 site. The reason for doing that is young people just interact in a very, very different way with space. To take Neil's point earlier around, you were sort of touching on the kind of concerns around crime and community safety bit. The analogy you used was like young people hanging out in the park and so on. The counter of that is, where have those young kids got to go? What's nice about them? And actually, if you talk to young people, they actually kind of want to be seen by adults, but they don't want to bother adults and be bothered by adults. They want spaces to hang out that are kind of secure, because it's quite scary being a kid in a city sometimes. There's quite a lot of things you have to kind of get your head around. So actually, how do you create spaces? Well, the best way to do it is to involve them. So we're doing this program where we're doing, I think it's 12 different sessions over a 6-month period where we teach them about how to get involved in planning and placemaking, and they tell us what they want to do. And there's a kind of contractual element of it. The flip side, for their time, we pay them for their time, and we also then bring them in and get them to do work experience opportunities or introduce them to other businesses they're interested in. Wholeheartedly recommend it. If anyone works in property development, honestly sign up. It's a wonderful thing.
I'm going to take Chair's prerogative just quickly to ask Neil a question, although the other panellists can come in if they want to. We've been talking about the advantages that cities offer young people, the attraction, all of this, the concentration of opportunity and so on. But then the Secretary of State for Levelling Up has just announced his slogan, "Stay local, go far," which seems to be all about trying to avoid young people having to make that decision and having to make that move. So is there a tension in the levelling up agenda between reviving our cities and the desire to stop people having to move to them?
So it's a great question. So I think what we're trying to do is find a balance, which is we as Conservatives believe in mobility and people moving to opportunity. We've always believed in that and getting on your bike and so on and so forth. But we also want to recognise the limits to that as a solution, right? That is not the right solution for everyone. And the truth is that people, particularly who are lower earning and lower qualified, are less likely to move. And in the UK, we have a good system that creates huge mobility for 50% of young people who go off to university and typically don't go back to where they started. But we don't have the same for the other 50% of the population. So what are you going to do? And it's to recognise, if you are lower earning, you maybe need your support network more. You need your nan to look after your kids because childcare is always going to be an expense. You need the community around you. And commuting long distances is less worthwhile if you're earning less at the other end. So recognising just the limits of that and people's desire to be able to make a success of their own community, not just have to move out to get anywhere. My life and a lot of people's lives in this room will have involved moving from somewhere, being in London for a time, maybe moving somewhere else after that. Of course, we are pro-mobility in this party, but also recognising we've got to have opportunities to get ahead for people who don't want to do that, right? And to widen the number of choices that people have got, and that's really where we're at.
Okay, wonderful. And I just take a quick moment to say to the internet, thank you for taking my plea for brevity to heart. But whoever sent the question, "What about local trains?" If you could send a slightly longer question.
What about local trains?
Well, precisely. If you could send a slightly longer version of it, I will gladly ask the panel. But I don't think I can quite work with that. Right. So, show of hands, please. The gentleman at the front there, and the gentleman there. Thank you.
Thanks. It's Chris Smythe from the Times. Neil, you talked about an oversupply of retail on high streets. I'm just interested in what you see as replacing that, particularly as that interacts with, you say, the shift to remote working after the pandemic. We don't quite know how that's going to settle down, what people want from high streets. And I suppose linked to that politically, many of the MPs first elected 2019 said the state of the high street was a big reason why they won. And of your four things, that is possibly one of the only ones where you can really expect to see clear, tangible results in the next couple of years. So by the next election, what do you want to be saying to people about their high streets and how they've been improved by levelling up?
Mm-hmm. Lovely. And so?
Yes, my question is about future of the high streets as well. Neil Salt, Lambeth Conservatives. I'd like to ask the panellists what they think of the idea of making better use of vacant spaces which are increasing on our high streets, sometimes for years on end. How can government assist local councils to work with local communities, for example, to try and make use of space available, to get local communities to make that space on shop fronts available, to get business improvement districts involved on the front line when they can't afford to be on the high streets themselves, working in conjunction with local groups to big up start-ups in the area so they can find somewhere to go and get a start-up business going, and generally to big up their areas and the people who are in it to try and improve those areas. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll start with Chris. And
Sure. Well, I'll come to that point first, Neil. How you sort of deal with the kind of vacancy issue and so on, which is obviously something that lots of landlords like ourselves are dealing with. A couple of good examples to talk through, actually. So Lewisham Shopping Centre, which I will bang on about to anyone because I'm from Lewisham and I will always talk about my hometown with pride. Lewisham Shopping Centre, I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, it's been around for a little while. It's one of those areas which actually really ties together the town centre, but like lots of retail, it's sort of had challenging times. Lots of retailers, obviously through the pandemic, before pandemic, pulled out. What we tend to do is try and activate those spaces as quickly and as culturally actually as possible. So a really good use in the Lewisham Shopping Centre is the Migration Museum. So it's the National Museum of Migration in the UK, both outward and inward. Wholeheartedly recommend going along to have a look at it if you've not been there. Took my children there for a learning or teachable moment just the other Sunday, which is very exciting. And you do take a lot from that. The other thing we've got in Lewisham Shopping Centre is a wonderful organisation called Circle Collective. And they, in effect, take young people from the borough of Lewisham. They train them how to be shop workers in a properly done up shop unit. There's a sort of, it's all very trendy fashion and skatewear and so on. So probably much where you guys would tend to shop when you're not at a Conservative Party conference. But they give kids really intense training, and then they do a job fair above. And every week they have to do 15 job applications, and they coach them through them, they coach them for interviews and so on. So a kind of combination of cultural and community uses I think is really important, and I think generally just being present and relevant in the communities where you operate is pretty key. So you need to be able to talk to the different organisations and people and find out what they need, and that's actually quite a big part of what we do as a business. I think in terms of Chris's question, what replaces retail, I mean, not all retail is going to be replaced, right? So there is too much retail across the UK, but it's not evenly distributed. So there are some places where it's going to maintain and continue to be very, very successful. I think in the kind of traditional high street setting, which is what I think a lot of these questions revolve around, they will probably be much more of a kind of mixed use of cultural community services. There will probably be some more offices that appear and potentially some more residential and so on. But I think it's all about working out what's appropriate for that place and making sure a planning system and local authority are there to partner with you to do something that's actually right for that area.
Neil?
It's a great question, Chris. I think I agree with Chris's points there. So I think a mix of things will happen. I think there'll always be retail in a lot of these places, and the challenge is to try and make that add something that the internet can't give you. That's why we've done business rate discounts to help independent shops particularly, That's why we've kept permanently the freedoms that we introduced during 2020 to do street stalls, tables and chairs on the pavement, create a nice sense of place. So it's about trying to make the retailers there strong, but there will be change, right? We're not King Canute as a party. We're about adapting to changes rather than just trying to freeze things in time. And yeah, there will be more officers' homes, particularly for kind of older people. There's potential from living in the middle of a town. Everything is walkable. It's easy. You've got close community and cultural facilities. And helping that change involves two things. It's partly about freedom, and so we've made our reforms that enable places to more easily change uses, so offices turning into residential and the like. But there's also a bit beyond that, which is about empowering local councils and communities to do placemaking, because of course, it is more interesting to take a town centre and better in the longer term and have a coherent plan to say, well, this whole street is probably going to become more like a living space, live-work space, rather than just say, well, here's a bunch of empty shops and one of them will become a house. There's less value from just doing that. What you want is some sort of placemaking function. So I think that is roughly the future that we're talking about for some of these places.
Well, look, the old idea of having high streets which were completely retail is gone, because people aren't going to go to a street anymore just to shop. They can do online shopping, so it's got to be about the experience, and I think we've all recognised that, and it's got to change. So the old idea of going to Regent Street or Oxford Street or any of our other big high streets in my area, which would be just about shopping, is no longer going to draw people in. So it's got to be about a mix of use, so that people can go there to meet friends for lunch or a cup of coffee or whatever it is, and also to shop. But it's got to be about the experience. So it's also got to be, as I was saying at the beginning, all about the built environment, how we are able to regenerate and renovate that built environment to make them attractive places, green places, places that you want to spend time, because otherwise people aren't going to go there. So you're absolutely right. It's all about how we, going forward with all of our high streets, it's about how we change the reasons that people are going to go there, and accept that it's all got to be about the experience, that people have to want to go there and enjoy it. And I must actually mention, and Neil mentioned there about alfresco dining, which in Westminster we started as a response to how we were going to help our hospitality businesses get through the pandemic. And we actually did so much of it, we actually created 16,000 place settings in our streets as a temporary measure, which was equivalent, we reckon, to about 200 restaurants in our streets. So it helped thousands of premises get through the pandemic. But more than that, what it did was it created a vibrancy and a buzz to those city centre areas, and actually not even just the city centre, but more the sort of the residential high streets, if you like. So the St John's Woods and the Belgraves and those areas, people really like it. It adds an attraction, a vibrancy, and it really helps to draw people to those areas. So, and we've because we had to put quite a few, we couldn't do it on our pavements, so we've had to do most of it as temporary measures by building out pavements, etc. We've just done some consultations with our residents, and across the whole lot, apart from Soho, which we're dealing with separately, we've had 85-95% support from local residents for them. So I think that's also a change which will be permanent going forward, about how we want to use these spaces in the centre of our cities. And over here, you were asking about empty spaces, and this is really relevant at the moment. 1 in 5 ground floor shop units on Oxford Street is empty. So what we're doing is we're working with our bids, with our landowners, and doing a great, I think it's great, scheme of pop-ups. So void activations, please, if any of you are in Regent Street, go to 88 Regent Street. There's a fantastic sustainable one. It's all about upcycling kimonos and making clothes out of eucalyptus. As one of my colleagues said, don't hug a koala while you're wearing it. But there's some fantastic things going on in these void activations. We did a wonderful one on Waterloo Place in a Crown Estates building, celebrating the Windrush generation. So there's a huge amount of that going on, because although these are community and charitable organisations who are filling these, but it brings life back to those units. What you absolutely don't want is empty units on these city centre areas, which just give a feeling of neglect and dereliction. So that's why we're activating those with these voids and the pop-ups, and working really closely with our bids and landowners who've been giving the units for free. But it's been a really great scheme.
Well earthed, because I was definitely going to ask you about Soho if you hadn't covered it.
I'm happy to talk more about Soho.
Right, show of hands. The lady there and the gentleman in the corner there, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Hannah David from Planning Futures. Actually, it leads quite well what Rachel just said about empty units, and also, Rachel, your comment about business rates. Now, you referred to, I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but ring fencing them for regeneration, perhaps. But do we need a wider review of business rates, particularly on empty properties, the exemptions? Would that help to regenerate our high streets? And I appreciate every area is different, but would it help to regenerate, or would it put a barrier up if we just continue the way that we are? I mean, obviously we have to move with the times. The high street's changed.
Okay.
Hi, I was going to ask a question about the link between the planning reforms and levelling up. They're now part of the same department, and I'm wondering how the Minister in particular sees them as being one supporting the other, and if it's too much to think that, does this mean that the planning reforms will start to view housing developments as being a potential cause of economic growth, not just a consequence of it happening, which it seems to be how it is at the moment, or are the two sort of not particularly linked?
Okay, so we'll start with Rachel.
Okay, business rates. Yes, there's a lot that could be done to improve the way business rates operate. But ultimately, look, business rates, I get it. It is a way that the government very effectively is able to raise a significant amount of revenue. However, as I was saying earlier, what we really hope is that the government will introduce online sales tax, and that will be linked back to enable local authorities to provide relief on physical business rates to our physical high streets, because unless we can do that, the physical high streets in our city centres are bearing all of that burden. So there needs to be some reflection on that if we want them to continue and we want them to survive. So I would really strongly hope that any kind of online sales tax provides the ability for us to provide release, and it could be also, we would really favour it being linked to businesses that are bringing up their emission standards, so that we can actually really drive that sustainable agenda in our city centres by being able to provide some business rates relief funded from this for those businesses who are really delivering in terms of making the buildings more sustainable. So I think that's going to be a key moving forward, that we actually address that issue of how we make the burden on our physical high streets more bearable.
Yeah.
So I thought it's a really good question. I think so. Our colleagues at the Treasury obviously have been working in terms of doing their review of business rates, and we'll have to see more about how that comes out. I think the one thing I do is situate your question in a bit of a wider context, which is it's worth thinking about business rates and local authorities' incentives in the context of the wider funding settlement, because obviously business rates retention, which we've steadily increased over time since 2010, is only one part of the incentive set facing them, and one part of their overall formula of funding, which can have different effects. And so I'd be interested in the views of people on what effect that business rates retention has so far had on local authorities. So I put it in that bit of a wider context. And in terms of the planning reforms, what's the connection to levelling up? I think it's also a good question, which is look, I thought that the sort of changes that the previous Secretary of State was making to take OAN more towards driving regeneration in our towns and cities was broadly sensible. The new Secretary of State, I'm sure Michael will want to take stock of where we're going, so I can't really honestly answer your question, because he will want to form a view on those things. But you probably detected from answers to previous questions, I think there is. It's interesting. You think that there's been this view that it sort of follows growth rather than drives it. That's interesting perception. And I think I think how you use these types of funding streams, your brownfield regeneration, your other ways of helping communities do these things to potentially drive levelling up. I think that you're right that the two agendas are completely connected. You'll have to watch this space in terms of what we will ultimately do, but the conversation we've already had gives you some sense of the importance that regeneration policy and housing policy can play in wider growth of places like this.
Business rates, yes, it needs reform, it really does. I think it's actually quite complex to reform it though. You soon start unpicking lots of different things around the sort of interdependencies of local authorities, what Rachael's authority does in terms of how it sort of is a net exporter and so on, the value that brings to other local authorities around the country. I also think it's going to be a bit, so I definitely believe that online should be sort of brought slightly more into the regime. I think it's going to be a bit more complicated than sort of taxing people back to the high street. Definitely online should sort of pay its fair share, but actually where the transaction takes place is sort of slightly moot. So to give you an example, I bought some shirts for my daughter's school uniform, which I got delivered, so I bought them online, they got delivered into the M&S that's below our building. I picked it up from that M&S. Where did that transaction take place? I then returned it to M&S because I got the wrong size because I'm an idiot. Again, where did that transaction take place? And it's quite difficult to really capture that sort of complexity. I think if you look at where all our retailers are going, they really want a sort of seamless experience for people from a kind of omnichannel perspective, right? So you should be able to look at something on your phone, collect it from somewhere like Blue Water, try it on, try different things on, send it back. Where your money actually leaves your bank account is a sort of difficult thing for us to really capture. So I think what we really need is a system of business rates that's more responsive to the changes in the modern economy, which is continuing to change. So something that kind of anticipates that movement, I think, is really, really important. And then on this other question on sort of planning reform, levelling up and so on, I suppose I'm going to ask Neil a question, actually. I thought I can. The big thing for me is levelling up actually going to be a cross-cutting government strategy? And if it is, do you and Michael get to go around to all the other departments and peer over their shoulder and go, have you thought about levelling up in that context? So planning reform, I think, is a classic example. Business rates reform is a brilliant example of, actually, if we believe in levelling up, and this is what this government wants to do and wants to be known for, a lot of government policies need to be addressed. And I would like to think you and Michael are going to do that. Please tell me that's true.
Yes.
Great.
We have, since the spring, we're working right across Whitehall with the unit that was set up, which is now the Levelling Up Task Force, absolutely working right across government with lots of different departments. There are lots of common themes and strategies that are common to a lot of what departments are doing. So absolutely, yeah.
Great.
It's always like scaring your panellists start talking to each other because you risk turning into a supply teacher if they do it too often. But I think that was a very productive exchange. Show of hands, please. Questions? You, sir, and just you? Just one question? All right. Oh, you. Oh. Sorry, the gentleman at the back after that then. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark Leftley. I'm from the political division of a comms firm called Powerscourt. We did some research recently for a client that showed about 1 in 4 doctors, GPs, currently practicing out of old residential buildings. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that every time we talk about regeneration, levelling up, whichever form it is, primary healthcare is very, very rarely central to any of the thoughts around that. And it's obviously very key to our communities, particularly as we need more modern, flexible healthcare facilities for building back from COVID. I was wondering how central or what consideration you're giving to primary healthcare as part of the bill. And I was also wondering, in terms of land security as a developer, whether you've noticed that primary healthcare access ever affected any of your developments.
Thank you. And then you, sir, at the back.
Hello. Derek Rachael. I'm the Director of International Strategy at the Charities Aid Foundation. Minor point of order, Mr. Chair. When Chris invited me to this last night, he clearly implied there would be free lunch.
It's not for me to back up Landsec's promises.
Exactly. Buy your lunch, Derek. Buy your lunch.
Isn't there famously no such thing as a free lunch?
But just to say, I think for the charitable sector, and housing and communities in particular are an interesting hybrid in the United Kingdom. There's no doubt that local communities have been hit successively over the last 10 or 11 years. And for potentially understandable reasons, that has put a squeeze on community groups and charities on the one hand, and also housing associations and other types of hybrid social enterprise that we increasingly rely on to rebuild communities. So my question to the panel is, What new initiatives would you like to see from government supporting charities and the charitable sector as we rebuild post-COVID?
Thank you. I think we'll start with Chris.
So I'll do the primary healthcare one quickly. I mean, yes, I mean, in terms of this kind of repurposing of place and so on, what you want going to see is much more sort of community uses quite embedded in things. So most office workers actually would quite like to be able to access health services without having to go home and queue for the GPs and so on. And I think as you go through into kind of retail repurposing, you'll see much more sort of services kind of embedded directly in those communities. If you do any kind of scale regeneration scheme, as we are increasingly doing, the first question you get asked is about pressure on existing services. So whether it's transport services, which is a common refrain in London schools, and then health, and those three things are actually almost the exam question that you get asked day one. Derek, I am sorry. I got you here under false pretenses, and I will buy you lunch later if that's okay. Not everyone, just Derek, just to be clear.
It's not the ex-lobbyist in you coming down.
Superb audience management.
Yeah, deal with that.
Extraordinary. Neil.
So on the, absolutely, I think this point about the number one thing, I think I've seen a graph, maybe it's your graph. The number one thing people ask about in terms of development is what its effect is going to be on local GPs, the pressure on local GPs, so it's absolutely central. And I've always been a fan of the idea of moving to the infrastructure levy and moving away from Section 106, which has got a lot of different problems that people in this room will know about. So I think if we can bring that off, and generate more value for the community, one of the things I'm sure that communities would want to see more is investment in primary care. And yes, absolutely, and I'm very conscious that there's a lot of sort of GPs still operating under kind of Dr. Finley's casebook style, out of an old bungalow. So there's a lot to be done in terms of facilities. And there's a good point about charities. I think you actually had two questions there. One is about housing associations, where they have gone in, I think, a more social direction, and I've written for ConservativeHome about what you can potentially do to measure some of that activity better that they do as social landlords rather than just landlords. Charities more generally, I think, fall under, I had 4 buckets about what Levelling Up was, about pride in place. I think they fall under that last one about, the spirit of community and place, and I was involved in a thing called the APPG on loneliness, which is all about how you create a sense of community and planning, community assets, all those kind of things, all the things we have policy on, are quite important in supporting that charity world, which does, it's not a big part of GDP, but it's a big part of people's lives. And over the last 18 months, as MPs, you realise like never before how important all these things are, and all these different voluntary groups in your constituency and the work that they do that you would miss if they weren't there. So there's a lot we can do in terms of development policy, planning policy, all the different rights to challenge and provide that we've introduced, the 150 million for the community ownership fund that's coming up, the things we've already done in terms of boosting community buyouts and things like that to try and help that sector grow, because it is part of our Levelling Up agenda.
Thank you.
GP pressure, primary care pressure. You're absolutely right. This is a key thing to make sure that we've got the primary care support where we need it, and it's a critical thing about when we're planning and regeneration is to look at where we can make sure there are health facilities. I mean, I have to admit, when I first started, I was cabinet member for adult social care and public health, which also meant that I chaired the Health and Wellbeing Board, which brings together the NHS and local authority. And I was quite surprised that the planning around GP practices was not more structured, let's say, than I would have thought it would be. Because in local authority, we know we have plans for demographic growth in each of our different areas. Using public health, we know prevalence of certain health conditions, where the older populations are, where populations that might need more health care are likely to be. So we've got all of that planning. So I think what would be good going forward is to look at how we join up that process more, so that we can be planning and saying, okay, we know that the demographic growth in this area is going to be X. We know we've got a big community which tends to suffer from this condition there. The health conditions there are particularly acute. We know that the 3 GP practices there are already reaching the maximum capacity in terms of residents per GP on their list. So we need to be planning more GP capacity in that area. I think that's what we need to be doing, and we need to be looking at how we can build that into our regeneration plans and our community spaces. And I really hope we get to that position, because clearly it's of critical importance to all of our communities to make sure that they feel they've got the access to the frontline healthcare that they want to have, and it's in a very accessible way. On the charitable sector, the only point I would add is I think we need to look increasingly flexibly about how about the actual physical space that charities need to operate out of. Quite often there's a feeling that they have to have physical space, and that's a huge financial burden on that charity, even if they're operating at a discounted rent, to actually be able to fund all of that. So we need to look at where they can co-work alongside other community facilities, other local authority facilities. We do this. We have a lot in our library spaces and other areas like that. We've been able to repurpose a lot of that space so that community and charitable organisations are working alongside of us. And I think that makes sense. That makes sense. You know, that they're not actually doing all their fundraising to fund their costs. That they're actually working in a much more efficient, effective way.
I'm going to jump in and ask Neil another quick question about empowerment, because it's a word that we throw around and it sounds very nice, and obviously it has lots of good implications, but there are times, I think, when local empowerment can conflict with delivering certain objectives. So we've talked about making cities greener. Now if you look at a map of London's supercycle highway, there's one borough which is a bit of a desert because it simply decided not to have them. On planning, one thing every Conservative MP agrees on is that there is a housing crisis, but that their constituency is not part of it and will have no part of the solution. So I guess the question is, what's the plan for when, you know, is there some steel behind this? You know, is there a plan for when the needs of the nation and the needs to deliver a nationwide strategy and deliver common goals, broad goals, conflict with the local interests or local preferences of people in particular communities? Yeah.
Because it's a classic tension in policy that will never go away between different levels. You can do things like from the neighbourhood to the ward to the borough and district to the council to the region to the national government. Right, there's always a right level for these things. You've got to, it's a balance of choices. I'm not totally sure it's true that all MPs don't regard their constituency as having any part to play in the thing. I think most people would recognise that there does need to be development, and they would have questions about where it goes and under what conditions. I get what you're driving at, but I think people do have a sense of that there is a role for supply and an important role, and that you do have to have some development everywhere. There's no one can just get out of having zero development. Look, there's a tension. I do think that the UK, compared to most of the polities, is pretty centralised, right? If you look at most measures of spending and taxing and decision making, it is more centralised than most of our peers. It's quite normal in Germany to be the minister president or somewhere, or a governor in a US state, be the mayor of Paris, then become president. We don't have that, right? And so we've lost a system for bringing people up to the national level, B, a vehicle to have experimentation. In the UK, they just use the nation as the only unit of experimentation. We don't have that kind of laboratories of democracy thing that they have in the US. Welfare reforms that were so successful in the US in the 90s came up from the state level. There are things we are learning from devolution in the UK that we can potentially apply at the national level. So you lose, good people coming to the national stage, you lose experimentation, and you lose local join-up if you don't have some devolution of power. You don't have the single number that the inward investor can call in Birmingham or Manchester or Leeds or wherever to find someone who can sort out the planning, the tax, the skills, the transport, everything you need in one place. And you just don't have that kind of grip. You need something at the local level to bring all these Whitehall silos together. We always complain that Whitehall's too siloed, and they have to come together in a particular place, and that is, there is a case for some more local power to do that. There's a reason, right, it's become like this. We had a sort of civil war between central and local government in the 80s, between the lunatic community and Mrs. Thatcher's government. As people haven't completely gone away. I was in a reception last night, nice reception about cities, Manchester and so on and so forth. At the end of it, a bunch of lunatics from the extreme left turned up and threw a glass of red wine over, interestingly, not over Tory getting pizza there, but over Richard Leese, who's the leader of Manchester City Council. Sort of the lunatic community are not completely gone away, but that sort of civil war between the centre and local had a cost. Obviously for local government, it had its powers stripped. Had lots of different types of local government at the city level abolished, but there was a cost to that in not having all those functions that you get in a more devolved country, experimentation, the join up, all those different things. So that is why we've been on this curve that has taken us slightly in a more devolved direction. We don't want to, though, have the mistakes I think that were made about, to your great points, about devolve and forget, that I think we did too much of in the settlements for the devolved assemblies. We want to know what's going on, not least so we can learn from it. When we did the local growth fund, what was the money going on? That was tricky to find out. Now, when we're doing a towns fund, there's a wrapper around it, so we're introducing people to each other so they can learn from each other, we can learn what they're doing. We don't want to have devolve and forget. We want to have all the benefits of devolution.
Okay.
Can I comment on
that
actually?
Please
just because just to add a sort of a local perspective on what Neil was saying, and perhaps it explains why poor old Richard Lees, who's a very great leader of Manchester, got the glass of wine thrown on him. But actually, it's the local governments that have to deliver on these things on the ground. So you can have central government saying these are the housing targets, but actually it's the local authorities that then need to deliver on them. And all of us who work in local government know that it's not easy in an inner city area. It's very difficult. You've got to, there's a lot of disruption, massive disruption, there's change, no one likes change, and you've got to work very, very hard with local communities, some of whom will never accept what you're doing, to do any kind of investment in the public realm, to deliver growth, but also to deliver housing. And I've got a number of major regeneration programs going on at the moment. In Westminster, it's obviously incredibly difficult. The only way we can deliver more housing is taking down what we've got and rebuilding it better and more densely. Will that mean that the buildings are higher? Yes. Do local residents like that? No. But do we need more homes? Yes. So actually there are some really difficult things that we need to do in local government, and we need to work with residents. And most importantly, we need to be able to show local residents what they get out of this, putting it bluntly. So we need to be able to show, one, that we have a local lettings plan. So these intermediate homes and these affordable homes that we're going to be building, those people who are in the immediate vicinity, you're going to have first dibs on this because you're the people who are most disrupted by this. So if you're in an overcrowded situation or you've got grown-up children who would like to bid on this intermediate housing, you're going to get first dibs because you're the people who are most disrupted. We need to show them how this will improve their public spaces, how this will improve the air quality around their areas, how this will help them, because otherwise, from our resident standpoint, and I can understand this, all they're seeing is massive disruption, the council focusing all its attention on building or developing, and why does this benefit them? So we need to be able to show our residents why us working to develop growth, to deliver growth in our high streets. You were asking about business rates. It's really important that we're able to then say we're delivering more growth in our high streets, which means the benefit to you, our residents, is that we can invest in these other areas for you. And if we're building more housing, we've got to be able to show how that will also benefit our local residents, why they will have some benefit from that, because otherwise it's quite difficult to get these huge schemes through.
Right, we have 10 minutes left, so one last set of questions, and we'll probably have to be a bit quick fire. Sir, yes? And yep, you at the end as well.
If I may, two questions. Greg Connery, South Pimlico. During the day, I have the opportunity to actually work in a Landsec building, which is very efficient, very green. It's actually amazing. But if I put, over the winter, you can write this sigh of relief at that point. But if I put an infrared camera on the 1960s office block next to me, it's going to be glowing red for the next 6 months, and has been every year since it was built in the 60s. Mm-hmm. How do we move faster for regenerating that? Is it money? Is it regulations from a technology provider? In my business, we'd say the technology exists. So A, how do we move faster? And maybe the second question, completely agree with everything you've said about mixed use as the way forward and brings young people in. There seems to be a debate raging about access. Is it pedestrianization of the streets? Is it bigger congestion charges? Is it UH? How do you manage that? And also outside of London and some of the other cities, do you see access? Do you see that improving sustainability? How do you deal with that sort of aspect? So the sustainability of the buildings and then the access area.
Thank you. And sir?
Thank you. Yeah, it's Hugo Fitzgerald from Hawthorne Advisors. Just a question really for Neil and Rachel. what role do you see London having, and indeed the South East, in levelling up? Because clearly there are many people who vote Tory in the South East, perhaps fewer in London, but it's something that I think an increasing number of people in and around that area getting quite fed up with. That the attention is just on other parts of the country, as obviously we saw with the Cheshire and Hampshire result. So what role do you see London and the South East having? How are you going to articulate that, make sure that people all feel bought into that? Is it just with the demand that London's going to provide for supply chain across the rest of the UK, or what else? Put meat on the bone, to use a common expression at the moment.
Okay, so we start with Rachel and work down the panel. We've got about 7 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. So first of all, Greg, who is one of my candidates in Westminster. So actually, when you are elected next May, you'll be able to work with me on improving the sustainability of the buildings, which is brilliant. You asked about access and pedestrianisation as well. I think the whole point about this is working with local communities. As we know, pedestrianisation also is a really difficult thing, because you pedestrianise this street, which the residents of that street might love, but it just throws all the traffic down the other road. So you have to really plan these things very carefully. We've always been quite wary about pedestrianisation because of that, because of the unintended impact on other areas. But obviously what we're all moving towards and working towards is having more active travel, better public transport, supporting people to choose other modes of transport, where hopefully we will be able to then be much more flexible about how we use our road space in city centres. And Hugo, delighted you asked about this. You asked the question about London. I could almost have planted it with you. Levelling up can't happen ignoring London. We have in Westminster alone, I can tell you, we have some of the most deprived wards in the north of the city of anywhere in the entire country. We've got the biggest age discrepancy of any city in the entire country, any borough in the entire country. So there is real deprivation within London as well. And the levelling up agenda can't be place-based, it's got to be people-based. It's got to take into account the actual reality of what people are experiencing. And if London is left out of the levelling up agenda, then that will be a real problem, because London is not only needs support as well because of the deprivation that we're seeing there, but also from some of the more commercial areas. London can't be ignored, because London is going to drive some of the GVA that delivers this. Westminster alone delivers 9% of national business rates, but the West End, as I was saying, is still the worst hit of any area in the country. So if we ignore that, then that's going to be a very significant issue. So thank you, Hugo. London can't be left out.
No, absolutely. There's absolutely no question of London or the South East being left out in any way from this. Not least because there is no shortage of poor people in London, as Rachel just said, or indeed in the wider South East. There are places that are extremely poor within a region that is, of course, on average, relatively affluent. There are places that are seriously poor. And I think there are other things that are highly relevant for London and the South East as well. I mean, I've talked about crime, right, where the serious problem with crime in the country is in London. It's an urban phenomenon, and so tackling that, the most places where crime is highest, is obviously an agenda for London. And I think that there is something, and the Prime Minister talked about this in his speech in the summer, beyond directly levelling up places that need living up in London and the South East. There is a bit of a national conversation as well about just some benefits from taking a little bit of the pressure off of London and the South East, and at the same time regenerating some of the places that need it elsewhere, because why is it that economies that are more balanced overall geographically are richer overall? Why is it that all the countries that are richer per head in the UK are also more balanced? It's not a coincidence, of course, because if you have a country where some bits of the country are totally overheating, you can't get on the tube or the train, house prices are on the moon, and at the same time you've got bits of the country that are crying out for jobs. You've got brownfield land, you've got capacity in your infrastructure. Well, that's obviously a poor use of resources, and that also gives you problems in terms of labour market matching. If people are not able to see good opportunities to progress and get better jobs near them, then obviously your labour market's not going to work as well as it could. So there's a sort of wider holistic opportunity from this agenda, but also rest assured, nobody's under any illusion that there's no places in London or in the wider South East that need some serious levelling up.
And to bring us home, Chris.
strongly agree with everything Rachel said about levelling up. I think London can't be left behind, and it's very reassuring to hear what Neil was just saying then. Greg, I'm glad you like your building. It's good. We're very proud of it. To jump to the question around the sort of 1960s office block, I won't talk about that building specifically, but what I would say is it's quite complicated reimagining and rebuilding in a truly sustainable manner. So actually one of the worst things you can do is knock something down that's already there and then build something new, because the amount of carbon, steel, glass and so on that you're creating there is really bad, and then you're sort of trying to offset that for many, many years ahead. So one of the things I think that's increasingly growing in our industry is the idea that you can kind of retrofit or repurpose existing buildings. So I mentioned Timber Square, which is one of the ones we're working on in Southwark at the moment. So it's an old Printworks, big, ugly slab of a building which we're now stripping back to its bones in effect and then recladding it, and as a result we're going to be zero carbon on that after about 18 months I think from opening, which is actually very challenging and well ahead of the industry. So more things like that. We're learning every day, we're playing around with these sorts of things, so I think hopefully you'll start to see much more of that sort of stuff across London over time.
Thank you very much. I hope you've all found this as illuminating as I have. It just falls to me to ask you to join me in a show of appreciation for our panel, all of them, cheerleaders of each chipping in. Thank you for joining us. There are innumerable other ConHome events, which I hope you'll join us at as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at some of them very soon. Thank you.